So I'd like to remind you all that we have our second discussion on Friday. It's important that everybody who can will come, or that everybody should come. And those who are online should tune in through Zoom. We'll be having, and it's important also to come prepared to speak on some level. That we'll have the discussion sheets posted by midnight tonight, hopefully, by our discussion leaders. We had a good conversation yesterday about them. And so bring the discussion sheets. They're a guide to what we hope to accomplish in the discussion. And also bring your own postings from the last two on the relevant texts. You already have done some of the preparation and work for the class if you've done the postings. And I encouraged everybody also, just to make sure you have something to say, try to find at least one quotation from each of the texts that we'll be discussing. There aren't that many. There are 3 texts, really. And if you have a quotation that you've thought through and can talk about in terms of its relevance to larger themes, that's also a wonderful way to prepare for a discussion, to make sure you are prepared to engage actively. But I want to begin today's lecture by reminding you of how far we have come so far, and what ground we have covered so far. Today's lecture is in many ways a turning point. And as I announced to you a few days ago, today's lecture, next week's lecture, in some sense are part of a larger story, the transformation of Europe and Russia after the First World War, or through the First World War. So if today's lecture is entitled Reinventing Europe, the next lecture, Reinventing Russia. And we'll be looking at first Europe and then Russia and the European mirror for what this transformation means. To remind you of how far we've come, I just say that we really began with the Faustian myth of modernity. The promise of creating a new humanity, a new society that goes back to the Renaissance, that goes back to the Industrial Revolution. And I alerted you in my first lecture to the unexpected or maybe even paradoxical nature of this transformation. Europe is nothing more than an outcropping of Asia. It's not even a real continent. And that there is a sense in which Europe begins with an inferiority complex, a cultural inferiority complex. That we look at maps of Europe, depictions of Europe, imagination of Europe in the Middle Ages. It's one of being peripheral, marginal, outside, not even at its spiritual core. Jerusalem is outside of Europe. That's Europe's spiritual core. So the problem or the story we've been addressing all semester, and we'll continue addressing here, is how does this marginal outcropping of Asia become so enormously powerful? How does it create its identities? And what are the myths that have sustained those identities? Those are all in the title of the course. Europe and Russia, Power, Identity, and Myth. And the Faustian myth, the first great myth that we've looked at, and maybe the most important one, we discussed as a kind of promise of integration, promise of integrated development and democracy, empowering the people to take charge of their own destinies, and at the same time unleashing enormous enormous powers of nature, in technology, in the Industrial Revolution, and the hope too that these two things might go together in a kind of harmonious way, that we could create a world in which people are both highly developed, which they have power over nature, but also they have the democratic sensibilities with which to get along with each other. If Europe represents anything positive in world history, I think it's the promise of that synthesis of integrated development and democracy. And we trace that hope, that promise, that dream back to Faust and the Faustian legend. Now, in 1848, which we encountered a couple 2 weeks ago, we saw how this promise of integrated development and democracy explodes in the middle of the 19th century with the hope for a springtime of the peoples. The phrase that comes into currency in 1848 is the springtime of the peoples. The awakening of the people to their true interests, the awakening of people to a hope in the future, the awakening of the people to the idea that they can really be in charge of their own development and that they can do this somehow democratically. And of course, the first thing we noticed about 1848 is that all these revolutions that promised this fail, and that the intellectual culture of Europe after 1848 is a culture that tries to answer the question, why? Why did we not get where we thought we were going yet? In many ways, we're still trying to answer that question today. So one of the things that is born out of the 1848 revolutions and this promise or hope of some kind of popular sovereignty is the social question. It's really interesting to trace where all of our academic disciplines come from. Political science, sociology, psychology, all of these disciplines are really born in the aftermath of 1848. They're born, what you study today is a product of on all the fields that exist, everything out of an attempt to make sense of what happened in 1848. In the 1870s and the 1880s, we start to see sociology emerging as a discipline, part of an attempt to answer the social question. Why didn't things work out? Freud starts modern psychology. What is it about the individual that makes it so hard for us to achieve this kind of harmony and development? Political science, as we know it today too, is an attempt to see how can states rearrange their political borders and make sense of relationships between states in order to achieve this objective. Economics doesn't really become a discipline until the 20th century. Political economy is a little bit older, but economics is also part of the same process of trying to figure out how human beings can become the subjects and the objects of their own development. In that sense, we're dealing with a very specifically European story, but it's a universal story in the sense that all the university departments around the entire world are really preoccupied with these questions today. Whether you're in China or in India or South America or wherever, you've inherited the legacy of 1848, and we can't escape it. In our last lecture, then, to bring us up to the present, we really talked about attention in the societies of Europe and Russia at the end of the 19th century, where we saw that there were at least two, you could say, great social phenomena that seem to be at the root of social development and change. One of these is war, and the other is revolution. War, as we discovered through the example of Bismarck at least, is often associated or identified with realpolitik, the elites at the top of society making arrangements, alliances among themselves, trying to engineer a possible future and then fighting with other elites at the top of society in other parts of Europe and the world to bring about the desired results. We looked at the Crimean War, which is basically the war that sets or lights the long fuse that leads to World War I. And today, World War I will be looking at war as one of those big, as one of the arenas in which the future is made and human beings change the narratives of their lives. The other big process that becomes important, of course, with the French Revolution is revolution itself, and perhaps the promise or hope that people rising up from below can call for a new world order, can call for a new arrangement of society, and can bring it about so that, in fact, the prime agent of change and development is the collective will of the people. In many ways, we see this tension at the end of the 19th century between the forces of war, the forces of revolution, between the forces of elite realpolitik and the forces of popular democracy. And these are everywhere, you could say, in Europe and in Russia as well. This is not a Russia versus Europe question right now. This is one that we can see within Russia itself. And in our discussion on Friday, I'd like you to think about how Pobyedonostsev's Tsar and Dostoevsky's Underground Man, in some sense, are on the two sides of this question. That within Russia itself, we have two figures who seem to, on one hand, believe that it's war and a realpolitik that will remake the world, and another who says it's the collective will of the people that can remake the world. That there's a possibility of changing the order of things so that we don't have any more wars in the future. Some of you might know that in its immediate aftermath, or actually even as it was going on, the First World War acquired the reputation of being the war to end all wars. It's a very optimistic and almost utopian way of thinking about war. We'll have this war so that we never have to have another one. So in the future, the human beings can remake themselves through their own means, maybe through revolution. Of course, it's the Russian Revolution that happens in the context of World War I, and that's what we'll look at next week. But for this week, let's focus on how World War I happens and how it remakes the world order. I said that today's lecture is a turning point. We're talking about the Faustian myth. It's a turning point because we are moving today to our second myth, the myth of national self-determination. And I want to begin this lecture, part one here, by talking about myths of self-determination in general. If nothing else, one thing we learned from thinking about the Faustian myth was that empowering people to become self-determining is central to what this promise of modernity is all about. But national self-determination is only one of three, perhaps, ways of envisioning that transformation and that remaking of the world order. We'll start with that. We'll move then on to the question of World War I, the total war itself, and then the solution to that, the League of Nations. I have two questions here. Who is to blame? What is to be done? These are often said to be the great questions of Russia and Russian literature. It's Alexander Herzen who writes the novel Kto vinovat, Who's to Blame? And it is several writers, Chernyshevsky among them, and Lenin later, who write essays and novels with the title What is to be Done? Что делать? But we'll use that kind of Russian lens to think about what happens in World War I. Who is to blame? What is to be done? And we'll finally look at John Maynard Keynes, the key figure for this week, on his own account of how the war made him no longer just an Englishman, but a European. But let's look first at these myths of self-determination. In many ways, you could say that the part of Europe we're in right now, Eastern Europe, and really all along the frontier of Eastern Europe, from where we are here in Estonia down to the Black Sea, we have a kind of Tower of Babel of ethnic groups and different languages and different systems of authority and power. It's here that the problem of self-determination is perhaps most acutely felt, because it's very hard to define who the people really are. Are they national groups? Are they classes? The whole preoccupation, you could say, with class divisions rather than national divisions is in some sense a Western preoccupation in societies that are more coherent nationally. Marx, coming out of Germany, of course, is then shifting his gaze toward France and toward England, thinking about societies that are basically linguistically homogeneous, that speak one language. But we have here emerging, this is what the question that has to be answered through World War I, and is being raised already at the end of the 19th century. Who are the people? We keep on talking about the springtime of the people. The slogan of 1848 says, the people need to get empowered. But the question we couldn't answer, nobody could answer then, was who are they? How do we know, how do we define them? And then, how do we empower them? That's what all of these ideologies are about. One possible way of thinking about this, of course, is that the people can be defined as members of a class. There are aristocrats, they are the bourgeoisie, they are the proletariat, they are the peasants. This is, of course, what Marx gives us and offers us, a way of thinking about the world's people as divided into classes, and that the struggles and tensions are fundamentally class struggles and class tensions. Then there is also the way of focusing on people as individuals. And this is probably the one that is most familiar and maybe sympathetic to us today. We love to think about people as individuals. The problems of past social orders is that they don't recognize the individual. Now we do, so everything's getting good. But individual self-determination is what it should all be about. In fact, in some ways, the ideology we live in, kind of a liberal ideology, is precisely what directs us always to see the problems of society as ones that are due to the fact that individuals aren't sufficiently empowered. If you look at any television advertisement these days, that's the subtext. You're not sufficiently individually empowered. Make a choice. Buy this shaving cream. It will make you more empowered as an individual. Buy this weight loss product. It will make you a better human being. Buy this toothpaste. It will make your teeth whiter. You will shine more brightly, and everybody will admire you. That's perhaps the crass, you could say, side of this individual self-determination. And I don't want to make fun of it because it's a really important, I think, component in this larger story. But the third and final, you can say, major theory or vision of who the people are is the national story. The people are not really classes, they're not really individuals, or that there might be classes and there might be individuals, but if you just focus on classes and individuals, you miss what's really important and interesting about people, the people, is that they actually have these communities which we can define as nations, and that those communities have a common language, and those communities have a common set of values and ideals. And only when we see human beings as members of nations can we come up with a world order in which they will truly be liberated. So if it wasn't clear before, I hope this you see is the big story of why 1848 is so important. It brings these three different answers to the question of who are the people to the table. And it's what we have been debating in some sense ever since. Each one, you might say, also has its own philosopher, or of somebody who makes this question really important. And here I'll just pick the three Jewish figures who in some sense make this question most important. Class determination, of course, Marx is the one who really brings attention to that. Freud, with his psychology, analyzing the pathologies of the human individual, is the one who makes us see that the problems of humanity are really individual problems. Go to therapy. Talk to a therapist. You'll be free of your problems eventually, and then we can have a better society when everybody is in harmony with themselves. It's kind of Freud's answer to the question, why Freud might be seen as a liberal philosopher here. Theodor Herzl, we were discussing on Friday, you could say the philosopher of, or the predictor of the Jewish state, is the figure who says, in fact, we need a national solution to this problem. We need to look for creating a separate nation for Jews, because trying to integrate Jews in the various countries of Europe will only lead to further oppression and further problems. So with these three sort of Jewish thinkers, we can see all of the answers to modernity and all of the problems of modernity articulated. These are not uniquely Jewish questions and problems, but you could say they are mirrored in almost every national community. You have Estonian liberals, Estonian socialists, and Estonian nationalists at this time. Yeah. He is Jewish, in that sense. Ethnically, right? I mean, they're all ethnically Jewish, right? But you could say that being the member of an ethnic group, if the ethnicities, in some sense, the question that was asked just now was, in what sense is Freud a Jewish thinker? My answer was that he's ethnically Jewish. I came from Jewish parents, and he experienced some degree of anti-Semitism in Vienna for being Jewish. He was very aware of his Jewish identity. But like many people, he thought that his duty was in some sense to overcome being Jewish. And that is, you could say, a very modern attitude. We have to overcome our past identities, the inherited identities of the past. Marx too, you say. Socialism and liberalism are similar ideologies in this sense. They both tell us we have to overcome our past. Socialists say we can't remain what we were, we have to become something new. Liberals also say we can't get caught up in where we've come from, we have to realize our individuality independent of our ethnicity, overcome our ethnicity and somehow. It's only the nationalists who say, actually, maybe overcoming ethnicities should not be the objective. Perhaps nationality is a good thing. And we have to notice this and respect it and make it part of our vision of the future. But what they all have in common, you could say, is the struggle for a higher human harmony. A belief that a world order can be created on these principles in which all human beings in the bigger scheme of things will ultimately find their place in the world and will overcome the need for war and will have a society that functions. One of the greatest, you could say, expressions of this on the eve of the 20th century comes from a small Eastern European town. Well, actually not even all that small. It has less than 100,000 inhabitants, but more than 50,000. Białystok, which is, I believe, in current-day Poland, but was part of this amorphous Eastern European region. It was there that Ludwig Zamenhof was born. This was a town that had a population that was very highly Jewish. It's 63% Jewish, in fact. But it had members of various national groups speaking different languages, and it's what led Zamenhof to try to invent a new language that would harmonize humanity. He invented the language of Esperanto. In 1887 is often given as the birthday of or the birth year of Esperanto. And I just want to cite a letter he wrote to his fellow Esperantist who believed in this language he had invented. He wrote it in Esperanto itself. It's translated back into English here. But it gives, I think, a good sense of the cultural dynamic, you can say the fears and the worries of Europe at the end of the 19th century. The fears and the worries that make these three ideological solutions to the problem of the people so powerful and important. The place where I was born and spent my childhood gave direction to all my future struggles. Doing close reading here, I just point out that the word struggle, again, is the favorite word of people living at the end of the 19th century. Everybody loves to write about their struggles. It's what Herzl writes about. It's what Darwin writes about. It's what Marx writes about. Class struggle, species struggle. It's what Hitler writes about. Mein Kampf, My Struggle, is the title of Hitler's great work. So the one where anti-Semitism gets sort of made into a theme is participating in the themes of the late 19th century, early 20th century as well. In Białystok, the inhabitants were divided into four distinct elements: Russians, Poles, Germans, and Jews. Each of these spoke their own language and looked on all the others as enemies. In such a town, a sensitive nature feels more acutely than elsewhere the misery caused by language division, and sees at every step that the diversity of language is the first, or at least the most influential, basis for the separation of the human family into groups of enemies. I was brought up as an idealist. I was taught that all people were brothers, while outside in the street, at every step, I felt there were no people, only Russians, Poles, Germans, Jews, and so on. This is a good example just of how individual people living at the end of the 19th century try to deal with a problem that intellectuals have been trying to analyze since 1848. The human race seems to be divided. We wish that it was harmonious. How could we create that harmony? And Esperanto is one of many experiments and projects, attempts to think through what it would take to create this larger global, or at least European, harmony. The desire to have an ideal language is something that finds enthusiasts, especially among socialists later, and liberals, maybe a little bit less among nationalists, for whom Zamenhof misses the point. The point is not finding one language with which to end all national languages, but rather to give all national languages their place in a higher global harmony. So there you see where Białystok is on the map, and sort of in the eastern parts of Poland, so very, very near the Belarusian border. 1905, the year of the revolution in Russia, in the Russian Empire, is also the year of the first annual International Esperanto Congress. It happens in Paris, like many things that try to unify the world happen in Paris. And ever since then, there's basically been an Esperanto Congress every year. I think there are only 1 or 2 years get left out. And in the beginning, there's a lot of enthusiasm for this idea of escaping the limits of our national languages and moving to a higher, more universal, less imperial language. And it hasn't totally disappeared, but everybody knows that today Esperanto is not a major movement. There are fewer speakers of Esperanto in the world today than there are speakers of Estonian. I want to conclude just this reflection on the idea of self-determination on the eve of World War I with a film clip, or rather a film trailer that takes us to a very local environment and sort of reminds us of how the world we're living in here, or rather the environment we're living in here, has had many elements in it that were important for the way World War I worked, the way the Russian Revolution worked, and the way the future unfolded. This film, it's a German film by Chris Kraus, concerns I think it was his grandmother, who was in fact one of these Baltic Germans who came to live in in what was then the province of Estland or Estonia before the years of the Russian Revolution. And he built this manor house. It's a wonderful symbol, too, of a crumbling world order. Notice, built on stilts, the aristocracy high up, but you can tell it's not a very stable world order in that image there. On the eve of everything that is to come and the collapse of that world order. One of the things to notice here, though, is that in the Baltic world, like in most of the Eastern European world, Marx's vision of modernity based on the bourgeoisie and the proletariat in conflict with one another was really kind of irrelevant. There wasn't really a bourgeoisie. There wasn't an industrial class that had produced new factories and that had created in the process a working class, a proletariat. There was still a very strong aristocracy. There was a kind of a professional middle class, an intelligentsia, and there was a big peasantry. And one of the interesting things about thinking about Europe broadly on the eve of World War I is how the promises of modernity, insofar as Marx writes about them, depend on imagining a social order that really hasn't happened yet in most of Eastern Europe, and maybe even in many parts of Western Europe. France is very slow in getting truly a bourgeoisie in Marx's sense. And the proletariat, of course, lags behind as well. The whole idea that modernity is based on this industry and the creation of those two classes connected to industry, an urban middle class and an urban working class, is almost an irrelevant question on the eve of the First World War. It hasn't happened yet. So this film clip, or rather trailer that I want to show you in a second, gives you a sense of this divided world order. And I would just call attention to the way in which actually class and nation are often grafted onto one another in Eastern Europe. In this case, the political elites are Russian. You'll see them speaking Russian. They're the soldiers who are in control of this region. But you have a really important educated German class here. The people who own the manor houses, the people who live in the cities, they're doctors, they're professors, they're lawyers. They're not really bourgeoisie in the sense that they're not industrialists or connected to industry. And here you have an Estonian peasant class. And you'll find different nationalities in other parts of Europe. But really you have a trilingual world order, a Russian, German-speaking, Estonian-speaking, or Latvian-speaking, other speakers of other languages. And they also have, at the same time, a kind of class relationship to one another. They're aristocrats, they're kind of middle-class professionals, or they're peasants. Let me play this clip now.
Государю Николаю II, ура! 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 Ура!
Ich war 14 Jahre alt, so jung wie das Jahrhundert. Nie zuvor war ich in Polen gewesen, der Heimstatt meiner Familie. Doch ausgerechnet jetzt traf ich auf diesen Abgrund aus Ort, Zeit und Gefahr, dem niemand von uns entrinnen sollte. Ich will nicht das Oder hinnehmen.
Wir machen das ganz vorsichtig. Es ist das Ehren eines Verbrechers. Und hier?
Die Kugel?
Sie treffen einen schlechten Menschen.
Seid ihr alle glücklich?
Sie müssen auch noch glücklich werden.
Wer auch immer sie sind, ich werde es nicht verraten.
Du bist ein Kind, oder?
Ich bin ein Kind.
Es war die kürzeste Woche in meinem Leben, aber die längste Woche im Leben meines Vaters. Also noch so viele Köpfe auf See, dass keine Ahnung, was den Menschen ausmacht.
Leute wie Sie verursachen eine Revolution.
Ich bringe Sie in Gefahr.
Oh, denk daran, der Tod ist wie ein Kern. Es nützt dir keine Flucht. Er lebt in dir, wie in der süßen Frucht.
Nimm mich mit!
Sie haben in meinem Tagebuch gelesen. Man darf nicht in fremden Tagebüchern lesen.
Ich bin Anarchist. Anarchist darf alles.
So here you have a kind of maybe overly dramatic almost sort of depiction of this trilingual world order You don't actually get to hear the Estonian speaking too much Estonian in this film, but it kind of helped make the career of the Estonian actor Tambet Tuisk, who got to play the Estonian anarchist here, and maybe took a role that this is not perhaps the most familiar role for Estonians sort of to adopt as anarchists sort of on the side of some kind of global revolution. It's usually there's more of a national agenda in the aspirations of Estonian peasants. But I'd just call attention to the one thing that we hear in this trailer at the very beginning, where we have actually the formatting is a little off again in the transit. But when the wife of the father, that is to say the doctor, who is sort of the father of the main character here, is trying to really address the social problem. He's cutting open skulls of killed people and trying to figure out if he can study through science what makes people good and bad, what it would take to make humanity better. His question is essentially this question of the Faustian promise and modernity. And his wife says to him, "You open countless skulls and you have no idea what makes a human being." I mean, it's a great line, but it's a line really about this attempt through science. It reminds us that what's going on in Europe at this time is this attempt to find a scientific model, create sociology, create psychology, create political science, create economics, all these disciplines that will analyze the social problem and help us to understand what it would take to create a society that's harmonious, where everybody ultimately finds their place. And through it all are these tensions. And then you can watch the film if this has perked your kind of curiosity about how this film ultimately gives a kind of a diagnosis of what becomes and how this trilingual world order on the Baltic on the eve of the First World War creates the conditions for the Russian Revolution and for its experience of World War I. But on that note, I want to move on now sort of to the meat of the lecture, which is really about the war itself. And the lessons that are learned from it or not learned from it. Because in many ways, in reading Keynes for this week, you should be thinking about he's a wonderful interpreter of the war and its outcome. And this was the first writing, his reflections or his writing about the economic consequences of the peace, trying to understand what the old order of Europe was, what the new order of Europe that had just been created would bring, and why it was not actually a good foundation for creating human harmony and world peace. And the other piece of writing is, of course, from his travels to Russia a few years later. But what I wanted to do for you in part one of this lecture is just to make you think about self-determination as a crucial part of the myth of the myth of modernity, of the making of a new world order. And that self-determination can be imagined in a number of ways, and that what happens really in the course of World War I is the raising of the question of self-determination. Who is to blame for World War I? Well, a lot of people say one of the prominent theories is it's nationalism. It's the rise of national sentiments in small groups that start to see themselves as cut off from others and start to hate all other groups. That there's a kind of this negative nationalism out there which is not about consolidating a new world order, but is about opposing yourself to others. That national sentiments have started to become prominent among the general population and certainly among elites who are at the top of society. And they're using these national sentiments to engender enmity between peoples. That's one common kind of theory of why World War I happens, or it's part of the theory. I don't know if you can think of what some of the other theories are. One of them is, and they overlap. These are not separate theories, actually, but these are all possible arguments. Industrialization itself. It's often pointed out that the processes of modernity that have made it possible for human beings to produce more things than ever before has often also made war unprecedentedly violent and dangerous. This is the first great industrial wars, World War I, where you have tanks, where you have poison gas. What are tanks born of? The Industrial Revolution. What is poison gas born of? It's really the second Industrial Revolution in Germany, the making of pharmaceuticals and chemicals. What is the machine gun born of? It's again the Industrial Revolution. All of these ways of killing mass numbers of people are are part of the story of World War I, and one reason why it's such a devastating war, which more people than ever before, really, in a war get killed. So maybe industrialization is not such a good explanation for why the war happens, but it's a wonderful explanation for how the war happens, for the extraordinary violence of the war and the way in which it actually really becomes the first total war, the first war that affects pretty much everybody in society. Just remind you about the contrast of the Crimean War that we looked at a little bit last time. The Crimean War, remember 1853, 1856, between Russia, France, England, Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire. That was a war that people went to watch on lawn chairs. They set up their chairs on the side of a mile away from the battle, opened their bottle of wine, and watched while the soldiers went to shoot at each other. It was a very different kind of era, where you could be very close to war, look at it from afar, and not really be swept into the process of that war. A total war is a war that doesn't let you sit on the sidelines and just watch. Total war is a war where you had not only the front, but the home front. Everybody was supposed to be mobilized. This is an interesting concept with which to think through the war and to think through its connection to modernity. Think about a war where nobody gets to say no, where everybody has to participate, and where at least the rhetoric is that, and the propaganda is that if you're not mobilized, if you're not actively participating, if you're not a subject as well as an object of this war, you're not doing the right thing. Discourse of modernity comes to war here too. A third, maybe general way of looking at the war and the question of who is to blame is really as an imperial war. It's a war not between national groups or national sentiments, but a war among the great empires. One of the Russian revolutionaries actually offers this interpretation directly. Lenin, in 1917, right, during the course of the war, writes one of his most important writings in his life, Imperialism as the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Essentially, he's trying to understand why World War I happens because, again, people don't recognize their own best interest. Because it's the capitalists at the top of society who have controlled the means of production, who are controlling then the politics of the empires of which they are a part, who are then organizing these battles among to gain dominance and to ensure their power on the world stage. Along the way, of course, the idea here is, and this is not actually an idea unique to socialism, and it's actually, we see it in a lot of right-wing ideologies as well, but that the people, this was not a war that served the interests of the people. Actually, that's one of the most common one of the common things said about World War I, and the most common ways of commemorating it. It was a war that was really about elites fighting amongst themselves, whether they were national elites or imperial elites or industrial elites, not a war that was about the interests of the people. It was maybe the last gasp, or just showed the continued power of elites and realpolitik, and the impossibility of achieving genuine democracy and power from below. So a war about realpolitik, not a war about democracy. That is what maybe all three of these interpretations of the war and who is to blame have in common. Those who blame the nationalists, those who blame the industrialists, those who blame the imperialists, all on some level agree that the people are never really consulted. It's about the elites and their realpolitik, their manipulation of the people below, and their manipulation of the geopolitical situation that generates this war. So this is all highfalutin theory so far. Let's look at a little bit more specifically at how the war happens. Not much, because this is not where we're going to focus today. But I want to take you to the moment of the outbreak, and then to the kind of global, rather not global so much, we're focused on Europe here, but the pan-European network of alliances that has grown up since the Crimean War, and really is why this war ends up becoming the first global war. Here's a photograph. It's wonderful to have access to these things. I think maybe 3 or 4 seconds before the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He's walking down comes out of this church. here in Sarajevo. He's gone there to show Austro-Hungarian, the Habsburg power and their interest and sympathy for this part of the world. And as he's walking down the staircase, he takes one more step perhaps, when the man we see in this other picture here, Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist, runs up with a pistol and shoots him and kills him. We have a picture too of what happens seconds later. This is Gavrilo Princip being carried off to prison. So think about how the war begins. The symbol of an empire, the imperialist, right? Franz Ferdinand, is being killed by the nationalist. This is one way in which the argument for nationalism is made about World War I. The nationalist kills the imperialist. And in itself, this might not be a big problem. It's just one man kills another. But what's at stake here is that long, big network of real political alliances that have formed since the Crimean War in the 1850s. And the moment this happens, all these different powers in Europe who have declared their allegiances, made treaties with other countries, have to take sides. So Serbia, you see Serbia in green there, right? And it's part of sort of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at this point, really, but the question is really about Serbia's status. It's part of this empire. The Serbian kills the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All of a sudden, Germany comes out on the side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire now is on the side of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Meanwhile, Russia comes in to support Serbia. France and Italy go in to support Russia. We have a whole network of alliances. They're not the same alliances we had in the Crimean War, but we have really the division of pretty much all of Europe into those who are on one side and those who are on another, where it's very hard to remain neutral. As you can see here, Spain is one of the few countries that remains neutral, and in Scandinavia we have Norway and Sweden and Denmark as well. But most of Europe is swept up into this conflict. France, Great Britain, Italy, eventually the United States, and Russia as the Allied powers, the central powers of Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. So empires are fighting here. There's a nationalist component too, but most of these polities are not yet nation states. They're really imperial states. Now, the first thing I want to say about all of this is that the way in which what I'm giving you right now is in many ways the most powerful and dominant narrative of World War I, which is the narrative about the real political interests of the elites of Europe and Russia, making alliances and then fighting between themselves for the distribution of the spoils. And that the people are really left out of the question. The people don't really care one way or another, it turns out. And that's the impression that emerges from a lot of the most prominent texts to be produced by World War I. World War I produces a lot more literary texts, perhaps any other war before or since, a lot more than World War II. War poetry becomes a major industry. In Britain, Siegfried Sassoon writes one of the most famous war poems of the day, Dulce et decorum est. What does that mean, Latin experts? Yes, it is sweet and beautiful. And then he leaves out the second part, which is, and we see at the very end of the poem, let me read this to you. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile incurable sores and innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It's sweet and beautiful to die for one's country. This is the perspective of a common soldier, maybe an officer, but still, he's ranking himself with the common soldiers of World War I. And what is he saying here? He's saying that we've been fed a lie. The elites have fed us a lie. We've been told that we have to go fight for our nation. We have to go fight for our empire. We have to go fight for modernity. And it's just, in fact, we're only fighting for them. We're not really fighting for democracy. We're not fighting for the common interests of the people. A lot of the poetry, this is just an excerpt of this one poem even, and I don't want to burden you with the hundreds of poems that were in fact produced out of this. But it's a good sort of illustration of the larger point. And the war poetry tells us that what's going on here is this contradiction between the people at the top and the people at the bottom. Germany also produces perhaps the most famous war novel of modernity, and the first international bestseller, basically in world history. It's Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, which I believe, this is the film version that comes out in 1930. It's produced by Hollywood and becomes maybe many people's major source of knowledge about World War I and the dynamics of it. I want to play this clip for you, and we can try to do a little close reading of the dynamics of what is going on here too. So we had a British poem, now we have a German story that focuses on Paul, soldier you see here, coming back to his old teacher, who is, and watch what happens in this confrontation. As Paul, the man who's actually been a soldier, now a common soldier in the war, comes back to talk to his teacher and to that teacher's class of students. Oh.
Realizing that there is no other duty now but to save the father. Paul! How are you, Paul?
Glad to see you, Professor.
Can't make it louder.
You come at the right now, just remember. And if to prove all I have said, here is one of the first to go. Man, he sat before me on these very benches. He gave up all to serve in the first year of the war. One of the Iron Youth who have made Germany invincible in the field. Look at him, sturdy and bronzed and clear-eyed, the kind of soldier every one of you should envy. Oh, lad, you must speak to them. You must tell them what it means to serve your fatherland.
No, I can't tell them anything.
You must, Paul. Just a word. Just tell them how much they're needed out there. Tell them why you went and what it meant to you.
Can't say anything.
If you remember some deed of heroism, some touch of nobility, tell about it.
I can't tell you anything you don't know. We live in the trenches out there. Fight. Try not to be killed. Sometimes we are. That's all.
No, Paul.
I've been there. I know what it's like.
That's not what one dwells on, Paul.
I heard you in here reciting that same old stuff. Making more iron men, more young heroes. You still think it's beautiful and sweet to die for your country, don't you? We used to think you knew. First bombardment taught us better. It's dirty and painful to die for your country. When it comes to dying for your country, it's better not to die at all. There are millions out there dying for their countries. And what good is it? You asked me to tell them how much they're needed out there. He tells you, go out and die. Oh, but if you'll pardon me, it's easier to say go out and die than it is to do it. And it's easier to say it than to watch it happen.
Okay, so I think in microcosm here, we have a wonderful depiction of the tension between, within societies in the course of World War I. Can anybody kind of just articulate in a sentence or two, what is the antagonism or tension here? Between, who are the enemies here? Officially, of course, the enemies are Germany is fighting Britain. Germany is fighting England. So the enemy should be Germans and the English. But in this clip, where is the tension?
Tension is between the people who see that the war has a point and the people who see that the war is pointless.
Exactly. And who are the people who see that the war, the tension is between the people who see that the war has a point and the people who see that, or think that the war is pointless. So who are the people who see that the war has a point? The people who are for the war, the people who haven't actually seen it, who haven't been there. And what are they socially? It's Exactly. So it's the people who are in a higher position, it's the teacher here, people who are elites in some sense. They're also older. I think you get the dynamic here too. It's the old people, the people who are, the people who are older in society. The older generation is telling the younger generation how to think about the war. The people with power, prestige, and status have one opinion, and the people who are in schools have a different. Yeah.
Over the summer, I read Youth Without God from Horvath. It reminds me of this one. It's kind of a reverse situation where the teacher is really against this warlike attitude of people, and he's discriminated against by his students, but also the director of the school. Right? So by then, what has changed? Where it's not just like this rare individual case where one part of the elite says, no, there is no reason.
This is about World War I too?
No, I think it's later. So
I have to summarize this somehow for the sake of it. Yeah, was the Horvath, is it Hungarian author? Or? Yeah. Okay, but a story of, there's a novel with a depiction of a kind of a reverse predicament where it's the people at the bottom who are most inspired by war, and it's the person at the top who's telling them not to. Well, in many ways you could see that as if it happens later on, it's one of the things that people learn from the war. They reverse their positions on this. But the situation is ultimately more complicated than it is presented to here. We'll get to that in a second. But I just wanted to show you through these two kind of literary artifacts, the poem and then this novel as made into a Hollywood film with, of course, Americans or playing Germans here. The question of who is to blame gets an answer. It's propaganda. It's education. We have a kind of very clear vision of the division of society. What matters is not the national conflict between the English and the German, which is the official conflict. What matters is the class conflict within society between the elites and the commoners. An interesting way in which we see how one set of conflicts and struggles is used to criticize and oppose a different set of conflicts and struggles. All Quiet on the Western Front was so powerful and important in the interwar period, and it is to this day because it perhaps is one of the great the passive. And when wars happen, the wars are usually, maybe always, between elites who have an interest that has no connection to the interest and the will of the people. And that, in the 20th century, had a lot of power and purchase going into the Second World War, which then changes people's minds again. But that's all in the future. We'll get there. One place where you can see the power, not just of education, we have the education in the classroom we just looked at, but also propaganda, that one way in which World War I, again, is a total war. It's the war of mass propaganda. The word propaganda actually gets invented during this period. Propaganda is a word that simply means saying things to influence others, or creating texts, visual or verbal or of any other kind, that ultimately have the effect of conveying your agenda, your point of view. Propaganda was not a negative word when it was first invented. It was part of what states started to be able to do, and you can say elites started to be able to do with their newfound powers of communication. Destroy this. This is a U.S. Army poster. These kinds of posters never existed before World War I, but thereafter, this kind of advertising and propaganda really becomes pretty much ubiquitous. Notice what's going on here. Can you do a close reading of this poster? Who is saying what to whom again with this poster? The question I invite you to ask of everything we look at and everything but if we did it all the time, we never move very far. But it's worth doing sometimes. What is the message here?
German beast soldiers are, taking Europe, I'd say, with women.
Yeah.
In the name of culture, it's just brutality.
The German beast is taking Europe, the women, in the name of culture, which is actually brutality. Sven, did you want to?
So Europe is in the background.
Yeah.
Ruins, and some beaches.
Yes, so Europe is in the background in ruins, right? We see kind of the stakes of this conflict are raised by showing the destroyed background. Exactly. It's also about dehumanizing the enemy. This is one thing we'll sort of start to notice. Is one thing that at least these 3 war posters I'm going to have for you all have in common is that the enemy always has fangs. The mad brute, the German militarist there, he's kind of a gorilla with fangs. Here we have a German poster criticizing attacking the Bolsheviks, shows the Bolsheviks as a kind of a gorilla-like creature with fangs, these sort of sharp teeth, right? And then we have a Russian poster here. Velika Европейская война, you see it written at the top, the Great European War. And we have the Russian knight or count there cutting off the heads of a hydra, of this dragon with multiple heads. What are all those heads representing? Which is the head that he's cutting off at the moment? The one with notice it's the helmet with a spike on top. That was a symbol of? That's the Germans, right? The Germans have it's the Berlin, that's the Prussian military uniform. We saw Nicholas II, remember, right before the war, dressed up in a uniform with that kind of spike on it when he was still playing dress up. But here we have the Germans with that represented by the Prussian helmet. The head of the Austro-Hungarians has already fallen off, been cut off. The white beard of the old emperor, and then we have the Ottoman with the Ottoman head here with the fez, this kind of Ottoman hat, also as part of this monster. Remember, they are the alliance of the Central Powers. The Ottomans are allied with the Austro-Hungarians, are allied with the Germans, and Russia, as the brave knight, is taking them all on. There are some subtle things you might pick up here in the background too. Notice, on one side we have the onion domes of an Orthodox church. And on the other side, we have Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. What is it saying? It's saying that Russia is not just fighting for Russia, it's fighting for all of Europe. And of course, labeling this the Great European War shows Russia as kind of a savior of Europe against the forces of evil, being the Ottomans, the Germans, and the Austro-Hungarians. So one thing we see happening here, this was a great point, which said showing the dehumanizing the other, showing the pathology, trying to represent your enemy, not just as a worthy adversary, but as something that deserves to be crushed and destroyed and eliminated, that has to be feared, that we are entitled to feel disgust about. This notion that we should feel disgust toward our other and our enemy is something that becomes prominent, you can see in the posters of World War I, and it's something that we see entering the discourse of the Russian Revolution too. When Lenin and Trotsky start to talk about their enemies as bugs and as sort of vermin and as monsters. But it's happening in Europe as well at this time, this wider depiction of the other as somebody who is not a worthy adversary, not somebody, another knight in shining armor, but actually somebody who is not human at all. So this is, just to conclude this major point here, is that this is an important aspect of the war. It certainly was there. This notion of that the real conflict of the war was not between countries, between empires, but was really within countries, within empires, between elites at the top and the ordinary people at the bottom. That this comes out in novels, it comes out in poems, it comes out in, we can use the war propaganda, the posters, to make this argument, showing how there's an effort on the parts of those who are in power to create an image of the other that's pathological. The last, maybe, piece of the argument for this vision of the people versus the war, or the people versus the elites, is the famous event. It actually was several events that happened around Christmas 1914, the first Christmas of the war. The war breaks out in August, when there were reported incidents of British and German ordinary troops on Christmas Day getting together between the trenches, sharing gifts, sharing food, standing around a common Christmas tree. It's often seen as one of the most moving moments of the war, and it's depicted in this way. It's one of these tear-jerking moments that makes you almost want to cry. You see how these people have been shooting at each other, and on this one day they say, "We don't care. We're going to be friends." And then, against the orders of their officers, against the orders of the elites, they decide to recognize each other as human beings. It only happens actually once. I mean, it only happens in one Christmas. It's Christmas 1914. It never happens in 1915, 16, 17, in the future years of the war. But it's a big part of, well, I would say in some sense, the myth of the war as the conflict between the elites and the commoners. There's always a lot of truth in myths, even when they are wrong, fundamentally. But ultimately, my argument to you today is this is wrong. This way of looking at the war. At least it doesn't represent the totality. And it leaves out many of the things that we have to explain in making sense of World War I. One thing it leaves out is why the people and commoners, in fact, give up so early on the promise of international solidarity. The Second Socialist International was a movement that was born out of the First Socialist International, born out of Marx's Communist Manifesto, and the belief or hope for a common socialist society that would no longer be based on different ethnic groups and different nationalities. This takes shape in 1889, but it dies in 1916 because the constituent national parties of the Socialist International did not maintain a united front against the war effort. The people who are members of the Second Socialist International, supposedly for human harmony, opposing the elites, all decide that they actually have more in common with their own national leaders than they do with the promise of this international solidarity. And it's important to remember that the war did not have the same impact on everybody. For some people like Paul, the impact of the war was to destroy, you could say, his appetite for war. And we like to believe that that's what happened to everybody. But here are two enlisted men, common soldiers, who in fact got very inspired by the idea of war. And war as a way to remake humanity. War as a way to transform the human order, the European order. Can you recognize them? These are their World War I pictures. Second one, I'm sure you recognize. No, but the first one is right. Yes, the bottom is Hitler as an enlisted man in World War I. World War I gives Hitler his first sense of pride, gives his first sense of accomplishment. Remember, he was living in a homeless shelter back in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Vienna in 1911. Now he's a decorated soldier. He gets rewarded for his bravery. He's told he's done a good job. And all of a sudden, he has the self-confidence. Hitler, like all of Europe, is born out of a sense of his own marginal position, his own sense of his own inferiority complex, that he's not good enough. And all of a sudden, he feels he is good enough. And this sense of personal entitlement, you could say, grows to unprecedented proportions. But the other figure here is Benito Mussolini, right? The founder of the fascist party, the founder of Italy under, you could say, Italy of the interwar period, fascist Italy. Mussolini is an interesting figure because he was actually a socialist originally. He wasn't a fascist. He was a member of the Socialist Party. He was in one of these socialist parties that was part of the Second Socialist International. But when the war happens, he actually gets nationalized. He starts to think, in fact, the true interests of my people, of humanity, lie not in this socialist integration and harmony, but rather in the Italian people and in the fascist program that eventually he develops with the help of some Italian philosophers for Italy in the early 1920s. So what I'm trying to show you with this is that the impact of the war cannot simply be understood as one that kills people's appetite for war, that shows the great class divide between the elites and the commoners. The impact of World War I is also one that inspires some people with the notion that war is fundamental to remaking the human order and to transforming society and to inspiring people into their particularist and nationalist allegiances. This sentiment is not merely an Eastern European one. The great poet of the pre-war era, Rupert Brooke, sort of the golden boy of England at the time. They said that he was considered to be the most handsome and most sort of attractive of young man in England, and also a beautiful writer. Everybody was in love with him on some level. In his poem Peace, 1914, it's in many ways a beautiful poem, but think about the message here. To turn as swimmers into cleanness leaping, glad from a world grown old and cold and weary, leave the sick hearts that honor could not move, and half men and their dirty songs and dreary, and all the little emptiness of love. What is he saying here? We're living in a world that has lost a sense of higher values. We're living in a world that has all the little emptiness of love. We care only about our egoistic selves and our aspirations to make a better life for ourselves. But what about a higher vision of humanity? What about the promise of modernity? What about the making of a new man? These are the things we've forgotten. And all of these things are things that the war can give us. We have to be, as swimmers, into cleanness leaping into water that will purge us of our egoistic and self-satisfied and self-involved lives. The war will make us true human beings again. So this is also a sentiment that exists. Certainly on the eve of the war, in many ways you could say Sigrid Sassoon's poem is written precisely against this kind of attitude. But this attitude does not disappear entirely, and it becomes an important part, you could say, of the post-World War I order. With this, I want to turn to the third big section of today's lecture, and the penultimate one, where we look at how the war, in fact, remakes Europe and the European order. And I title this The League of Nations because I think if you had to reduce to a single concept or phrase what World War I produces, is it produces a new vision of Europe in the world. The League of Nations is that vision. A vision of the world, in other words, not based on imperial treaties, but on nation states united in a common cause. So this is all, you could say, the League of Nations in some sense is the answer to the question, what is to be done? After World War I, the desire to escape from the evils of the war leads to this new approach to geopolitics. And this is where of course, political science or political theory and political studies, this course can really inform our thinking about all the things that you are studying as political scientists. A Europe of, and this is the ultimate outcome, and I just want to make it as clear and simple as possible. A Europe of really 3 national republics gets turned into a Europe of 13 national republics. Before this, most of European states are empires, and they have imperial relations with one another. In the aftermath, though, we have the breaking up of all those Eastern European empires, and the adoption of a principle of government and a principle of power that's really fundamentally different from what came before. Now, the war, in some sense, is important here because it's cleared away the architecture of the past. It's cleared away the imperial relationships. It's created not a blank slate entirely in John Locke's sense, not a tabula rasa, but it's created an environment in which things are possible that might never have been possible before. The new ideal of Europe, I think, is wonderfully expressed in Mark Mazauer's book, Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century, which I sometimes assign as an entire book in my American version of this course. But I just pluck one quotation here for you right now from an inhabitant of, it's a kind of a nameless ordinary person in Ottoman Salonika in 1908, where we see, even before World War I, the idea that a new world order could happen and that a new world order involving nations and might be what saves us in the end. Constitutionalism is such a wonderful thing that anyone who doesn't know what it is a donkey, is the quotation as it's issued. Now, this is simply to remind us that people care about this idea at the lowest levels too. This is not something that just elites are interested in as the remaking of society. We have people, villagers here and there, talking about these issues as well. But I've put in the subtitle of this section here, Liberal Constitutional Parliamentary Democracy, and you might write down those 4 words, because these are the 4 words that are really the basis of the entire reconstruction of Europe after World War I. When we talk about democracy, I want to make a distinction between democracy as a big concept, and that's the way I'm usually use it, the notion that the people should rule themselves, and that has no particular system connected to it, and democracy in the little sense, the sense that we usually use it when we're talking about the European Union or about the political institutions we have today. And it usually takes this form in the little sense. When we talk about democracy, we actually mean liberal, constitutional, parliamentary democracy. It means not just democracy, but it means democracy based on liberalism, individual rights, also based on having a constitution, a written document, or a set of legal code that will enshrine those rights, and having a parliament too, having some group of citizens who are appointed the task of being representatives of the people and making the laws. That's what we often mean, is this very specific sense of democracy. And this specific sense of democracy is what the League of Nations and what the post-World War I European order is based on. So those are four separate, you could say, components to the agenda. The liberal component, the constitutional component, the parliamentary component, the democratic component. And this becomes then the new European world order, the order that, too often we confuse democracy with this version of democracy. Democracy is a much bigger concept. And we'll talk about the other forms of it and the other associations. But the modern European notion of democracy, which people are debating in Brussels and in our governments, this is really what they're talking about. So what does this look like when we look at a map of Europe? When national self-determination becomes the great, you could say, principle for the remaking of the world order. The notion that we can create harmony ultimately by dividing the world up, or dividing Europe up at least, into nations, and giving each of those nations a state, and making sure that the states are constitutional, parliamentary, liberal, democratic. And this is where the world should go. It doesn't mean that, the point here is not every country becomes this right away, but this is the agenda. We say the post-World War I agenda is creating a European world order where every government will be a national government, not an imperial government. If there's an empire, we have to break it up. Let's go to the idea. Before empires were okay, now empires are not okay. And now we break it up, turn it into nation states, and those nation states based on liberalism, based on parliamentarism, based on constitutionalism, and that way we'll achieve ultimately the rule of the people that we've been dreaming for since 1848. Where that's the only way democracies are possible. Now, I think a lot of people in Europe today still believe in this on some level. I think this is really the answer to creating a better world order: parliamentary, liberal, constitutional democracy. That's the only way democracy works. So what actually happens here? The Russian Empire turns into a lot of different nation states, right? First, there's a period, and we'll look at the Russian question next time, because that's kind of it's a problem and a phenomenon unto itself. It becomes the Soviet Union eventually. But first, it's broken up. And for the better portion of a year, it's really unclear what form of government Russia will take. Between the February Revolution of 1917 and the October Revolution of 1917 is a period where anything is possible, it seems, in Russia. It could be liberal, it could turn into something else. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania become nation states in this period, breaking off from the Russian Empire. Poland becomes a nation state and becomes important again in the world. Similarly, the Austro-Hungarian Empire breaks up into its constituent parts. We get Hungary and Austria and Czechoslovakia as the major ones. But there are a lot of other little ones in there too that are or parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that also have their national movements, some more successful than others. The Ottoman Empire here breaks up, and its European portions turn into Romania, Bulgaria, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and ultimately Turkey. I've put in boldface for each of these empires the nation state that seems to inherit the mantle of the empire. Turkey is in some ways the inheritor of the mantle of the Ottoman tradition. Austria is the inheritor of the mantle of the Habsburg Empire, and Russia as a nation is also the inheritor of the legacy of the Russian Empire. This process of breaking Europe up into nation states, in some sense, begins a little bit earlier, and the phrase "the Balkanization of Europe" is often used to describe it in a negative sense. Because we start to see the fissures breaking up the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 19th century already. I mentioned to you in the last lecture the 1908 Young Turk Revolution of the Ottoman Empire as comparison to the 1905 revolution of Russia. And the person who becomes really important and powerful in the remaking of Turkey is this man here, Mustafa Kamal Ataturk, who undertakes. And what I think is so fascinating about him and about his reform is he really doesn't only undertake the reinvention of the Turkish political system, but the reinvention of the Turkish language. He actually takes things a step further. He takes the Turkish language from something that looks like this, using Arabic script, to something that looks like this. Effectively, he Europeanizes Turkey. Right? He uses the Latin script, and he doesn't use Cyrillic. He could have used Cyrillic. And a lot of the Turkic languages in Russia and the Soviet Union start using Cyrillic eventually. But you can see some of this petition to make the former Ottoman Empire, now Turkey, European, in the use of a new alphabet. This has a really interesting impact and effect, which is worth sort of contemplating. No other, I think, country takes as radical steps to reform its own language. I mean, it's true that the Russian language after the Russian Revolution is different from the Russian language before. Some letters disappear. But basically, if you can read Russian, modern Russian, you can read also 19th century Russian. The thing about Turkey is, if you can read modern Turkish, there's no way you can read Old Turkish. The whole cultural legacy and tradition of Turkey or the Ottoman Empire gets lost in the process of this transformation in the name of modernity. This is a good way of thinking also about aspiration to modernity. Because Ataturk is very interested, this is what that text says, in fact, in English. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. This comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But as you can see, you can express this in any language. Now, Robert.
Maybe I'm wrong, but was there also a discussion about making Cyrillic a part of history and adapting the Latin script?
The question is, was there among the Bolsheviks conversation about abandoning Cyrillic and moving to the Latin script? This is a subject for next week. And the short answer is yes, there was. But there, we'll get there. What I wanted to just point out here is that it's the American president, and this is before America is a superpower, right? Before America is actually all that important at all on the world stage, but maybe one of the first moments in which an American president, an intellectual, he was the president of Princeton University before he was the president of the United States, plays a major role in kind of setting the agenda for European and maybe global development. This is the January 8th, 1918 speech. In the 14 points, he talks about the world order that he would like to see emerging out of the First World War. Based on open diplomacy, access to the seas, the removal of trade barriers, the reduction of armies. You can find all of these on Wikipedia. You don't need to write them now. But it's useful to think about what they, as a whole, what they mean. I've reduced these basically to 2 or 3 words. If you look them up on Wikipedia, you're going to get 2 or 3 sentences. The evacuation of Belgium, resolving French border disputes, resolving Italian border disputes, the turning of Austria-Hungary into autonomous states, the independence of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, the Ottoman dismemberment, taking apart Turkey, turning it also into nation states, Polish independence. These are the 14 points. And then most importantly, maybe the only one worth writing down or remembering is this last one. The creation of a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purposes of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. That's where the heart of the agenda lies. And perhaps the new European order for the 20th century. A new European order based on breaking up empires and resolving the question of modernity and the question of self-determination by giving every nation a state. This is the theory. This is where you can say decolonization as the great 20th century movement in Africa, in Asia, and South America comes from too. It's all based on this notion that we can make the world harmonious and whole by recognizing the importance of nations, not by ignoring them, not by overcoming them, by recognizing their importance, and then bringing them together in a larger system, which he calls, or which gets to be called, the League of Nations. The League of Nations is going to replace the system of imperial treaties and imperial relationships that's dominated the world so far. When I teach world history, I often use 1918, 1919 as the great turning point. The turning point in which a world order based on empires that's lasted for 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years finally turns into a world order based upon a new principle of politics, the nation state as the ultimate unit of the political system. It certainly becomes the aspirational unit after this moment. This is what you can say after this moment. It doesn't mean empires all disappear, but it means that empires are all of a sudden seen as bad things. Before this, empires can be good things too. After this, they become bad, and they become especially bad as we move on through the century after World War II. So, The League of Nations is this new organization designed, think about this as a new part of a new world order. The point of the League of Nations is to create an environment, a global environment, in which all those individually now created nation states, or in the future to be created nation states, can have a respectful relationship to one another. The world effectively chooses the nationalist path or answer to the solution of the problem of the springtime of the peoples and the questions of 1848. And it does this both, I'll argue, and this is more controversial for next week, both in Europe and in the Soviet Union. The difference, of course, between the Europe and the Soviet Union is here it's a nationalism fused with liberalism. In the Soviet Union, it's a nationalism fused with socialism. But let's look, that's all for prefiguring next week. For now, let's just look at what, in theory, this new organization founded on January 10th and lasting from 1920 to 1946 was supposed to do. The main aim was world peace. So overcoming war, having fought a war to end all wars was part of the agenda. And the idea was that the New World Order would be based on collective security and disarmament. We would gradually remove all the weapons from the various countries to make sure that they wouldn't fight among themselves. And it would be based on this negotiation and arbitration among the newly created nation states. Those are the main aims. So three, basically. Keep people secure, get rid of the weapons, and make sure that we have communication, not fighting, as the basis of the way we interact with each other. And we have a legal system and a legal courts that can deal with this. International law becomes increasingly important in the 20th century. Secondary aims are improving the conditions of ordinary people. Labor conditions are even brought into the treaty. Just treatment of natives, the notion that if there are people who are living on your territory and you're an occupant of that territory, we have to come up with a system that's not going to treat them like they're not human. Human and drug trafficking rules. Somehow we have to make sure that in the new system of nation states, we have a way of keeping track of what's moving between countries and that we don't allow all kinds of harmful practices to dominate. We can't traffic humans, we can't traffic drugs. A global arms trade has to be reduced and sort of regulated. Disarmament might be our main aim, but before that, we have to make sure that the weapons that are out there are all, we're aware of them. We know how they're moving, what's happening with them. Global health becomes a concern. Just treatment of POWs, prisoners of war. The protection of minorities. And this is, if you write one thing from the slide, it might be the protection of minorities. This idea that we understand that in the creation of a new world order based on nation states, the dominant nationality has the ultimate rights, you could say, in any given nation state. But we can't forget the minorities living in all of these nation states. When we create Estonia, not all the Russians and not all the Germans are going to move out of here. Not all the Swedes, right? So there has to be protections for those populations as well. The idea is that these kinds of protections have to exist in every new nation state as well, to make sure that we don't get too ambitious and too chauvinistic with our nationalism. There's even a proposal at the beginning to use the international language invented by Ludwig Zamenhof, Esperanto, as a kind of perfectly, you could say, neutral language of communication for the League of Nations. Not enough people spoke Esperanto. It would have required a lot of effort, but I think it's important to remember that they tried. They attempted this. What they ended up doing, of course, was use the most common languages of the day, most powerful language. English, French, and Spanish became the official languages of the League of Nations. But nobody was entirely happy with that either, because these were imperial languages. English, French, and Spanish had been the languages of the countries that were most successful in dominating others. And there was a kind of a fear that we're rewarding aggression, we're rewarding militarism, we're rewarding past, you could say, injustice by making those languages the languages of the League of Nations. There were 42 founding members, and it kept on growing over the course of the 1920s and 30s. Into the 58 members by the second half of the 1930s. And here's one of the great ironies of it all. The USA never joined, even though President Wilson really came up with, in some level, with the idea. But the Soviet Union did. It joined in 1934. was expelled in 1939 for its invasion of Finland. It's just a helpful reminder that history is always messy. It doesn't happen the way you expect things to work. There are fascinating sort of exceptions to most of the rules through which we would like to understand the unfolding of time. From 1936 to 1946, here was the Palace of Nations in Geneva. Switzerland, the neutral country, became in some sense the capital of the League of Nations, the center for where this new world order would be based. We can think of the comparison to having Brussels, as the key city of the European Union now. How the pursuit of a city, of a place that is in some sense not the biggest place there is, not the most powerful, but that is in some sense neutral, is really what's at stake here. I still have 5 minutes, so we get finally here to Keynes himself, an Englishman in Paris, and becoming European. Because Keynes is there all along for all of these discussions and for all of these, for this process. Keynes says that, and this is maybe one of the most important things to take away from his general attitude toward Europe at the end of the First World War, and to his own, and the way it intersects with his own biography, is his sense that in participating in these negotiations, he becomes European. He says, and he sees that there is a weird way in which England is actually more foreign to Europe than Russia is. Let's read. England still stands outside Europe. Europe is a part, and England is not, of her flesh and body. But Europe is solid with herself. France, Germany, Italy, Austria, and Holland, Russia, and Romania, and Poland throb together, and their structure and civilization are essentially one. Russia and France and Italy have more in common with each other than they do with England, according to Keynes. Interesting, we're thinking about it. They flourish together, they have rocked together in a war which we, Englishmen, in spite of our enormous contributions and sacrifices, economically stood outside, and they may fall together. Keynes is telling us that there is an economic interdependence among the nations, among the polities of Europe, and that England doesn't share that interdependence. Why not? England has its empire. It has India. It has all of these other territories outside of Europe that it's much more connected to and dependent on. It's an interesting idea. And when we're trying to think about what is this boundary between Europe and the world, that sometimes it's actually England that is the exception rather than Russia. And according to Keynes, at least in this economic sense, all of these European nations have something together with Russia. So one of your tasks in reading and maybe thinking about the post for this week is, what is the nature of that economic interdependence? So why is it so important? How does he think that this economic interdependence creates cohesion within Europe and ties them to Russia and among themselves? Of course, this is what he has to say about himself. He says, an Englishman who took part in the Conference of Paris and was during those months a member of the Supreme Economic Council of the Allied Powers was bound to become, for him, a new experience, a European in his cares and outlooks. So even as he's talking about the transformation of Europe, he's talking about the transformation of himself. This is a subject and objects of modernity, right? He's here. Keynes is changing. He sees himself at the moment he sees Europe changing. And that he's changing because by traveling to Versailles, to Paris, he's seeing things that he never noticed before living in England. He's seeing this economic interdependence. And what he does a brilliant job of. He was one of the smartest figures of the day and probably the most important economic thinker of the 20th century. But this was when he was still a cocky young man who was convinced of his superior intelligence to everyone around him, writing in a very kind of eloquent way about the kind of stupidities of the older people who dominated the political conversation. I'd ask you to think about his account of the Council of Four. France, dominated by George Clemenceau, Prime Minister. Britain by David Lloyd George, Prime Minister here. Italy, Vittorio Orlando, and finally USA and Woodrow Wilson. And how it's the interaction and conversation among these four elites. What languages do they speak in common? Who speaks the most languages among them? Language question is here pretty interesting too. It's who they don't all speak the same languages, and this has ultimately an important effect, he says, on the outcome of the conference and the way things unfold. But the main thing that most people have pointed to, and Keynes points to this too, and I want to alert you to it now so you don't have to look for it too hard while you're reading, is Article 231 of the Versailles Treaty of 1919, also often known as the War Guilt Clause. Right? It's that part that says Germany has to take the entire blame, basically, for the war. It's called a Carthaginian peace, referring back to ancient Rome and its battles with Carthage, but that this is not a peace that is designed to create good feeling among the winners and the losers. It's designed to punish the losers and to reward the victors. And in punishing the losers, Keynes's point is it actually does something to hurt the winners. It's up to you to figure out what that is. But when you're reading Keynes, sort of be looking for that. What is it about punishing the losers that actually hurts the winners, that makes this the world order after the First World War I so unlikely to be successful, so inclined? He basically predicts World War II already in 1920 on the basis of the way in which the peace was handled by these four figures, and the way that their kind of national preoccupations with protecting their own group against the other gets in their way of understanding the economic interdependence between them. So what was so bad about the peace? Well, it was 132 billion marks, which Germany was required to pay for basically the expense of the war. By making them pay so much, it had basically destroyed the German economy and made it almost impossible for Germany to function in the next few years. But again, the point is it didn't just destroy Germany. It also in some ways destroyed France. It destroyed the other countries that were supposedly benefiting. Again, the question for you is how? All of this takes place in the same Hall of Mirrors, where you remember Bismarck proclaimed the German Reich, the Second German Reich. You can see in the paintings here the same mirrors, the same columns behind. We'll skip that, and I want to just conclude with a brief look at here. It should be a minute or two, just at Keynes and his circle, just so you have a sense of the context out of which he came. These were Keynes's friends. They were very highly connected. The Bloomsbury Group is how they're named often or remembered. Authors like E.M. Forster, who wrote A Room with a View, Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. They all wrote about rooms, it seems. Keynes himself, who may be the most famous member of the group. Duncan Grant, the painter. It was had a very free atmosphere, this group, you could say. From 1910 to the 1930s, they got together in Bloomsbury, London. They had all been to Cambridge University and the members of King's and Trinity colleges there. And they were members of the secret society, the Apostles, which tried to sort of, in the form of a Masonic society, kind of imagine a greater future. But their attitudes and beliefs, and this is where we're going to end for today, is really anti-bourgeois on some level. They rejected bourgeois conventions and Victorian attitudes. They were feminist, they were pacifist, they believed in sexual liberation, in literature and art. Keynes, you might not know, was bisexual, and his first major love was actually Duncan Grant, the painter here. Later, he fell in love with the Russian ballerina Lydia Lopukova, and their marriage was important, partly because it made Keynes sort of aware of what was going on in Soviet Russia. But this was such an open-minded group that nobody seemed to suffer any kind of trauma for these kind of unconventional practices or views. It was a time when, as a member of the Bloomsbury Group, you could be very well accepted, even being homosexual or being bisexual or doing whatever you wanted with your private individual life. In many ways, the person who had a much harder time getting accepted by the Bloomsbury Group was Keynes's wife, the Russian ballerina Lydia Lopukova, Lady Keynes, as she came to be known, because she was kind of seen as not participating in the same bohemian spirit as the group. She had an accent, of course. She was from abroad. And it's sort of worth remembering that, yeah, the people who are included and the people who are excluded might in the long run sort of surprise you. We've run out of time, so I'm going to leave it there. There's more things to be said about Keynes. Maybe the last thing I'll say is simply he was also the president of the British Eugenics Society. He believed in the improvement of the human race, of human people, by genetic experimentation, even though, and this was very common at the days. We think of this as something associated with Hitler and with the Nazis, but in fact, almost every European society had a eugenics society. The Swedes certainly did. Americans did at the time. And we do history a disservice when we identify it only with Nazi Germany. It reminds us, though, too, that the project of making human beings better, whether by voting or by transforming them genetically, was a fundamental part of the agenda of modernity that lived on through the 1920s and the 1930s. So thank you, and I'll see you on Friday.